Hello, my name is David Reynolds. I'm pleased to be with you this evening, virtually, if not for real. Part of the fun of a book festival like Warwick Woods is the chance to talk, to have questions and answers, conversation with the public, with readers. That's not possible, but at least I've got a chance through the virtual medium to talk to you a little bit about a book of mine that's been published last year, now just out in paperback in a revised and updated edition. It's called Island Stories: An Unconventional History of Britain. And it's kind of a romp through British history, the last millennium, in 200 pages, not too heavy, illustrated with some cartoons, a few from the 17th century, others modern. And what it's trying to do is pick up on a concern I have developed during the Brexit debate, that we are talking about our future with, it seems to me, a somewhat simplified view of our past. And so the point of the book is to really encourage debate and conversation about the way we in Britain think of our history. Now, the book, I'll just show you the contents page. So this is the first and last chapters, in a sense, give you a feel for the Brexit debate. The core chapters are the ones in the middle, chapters 2 to 5, which are what I want to talk about this evening. They touch on the major themes that are central to this book. First, the concept of decline, then Europe, then Britain, and finally empire. And so in the time available to me, I want to go through those four themes and give you a little bit of a flavor of what the book's about. So first of all, decline. This has been an obsession of British politicians, not just in the Brexit era, but for, well, the best part of a century or so. I quote people like Joseph Chamberlain, Winston Churchill, complaining about the sense of decline, blaming it on a lack of willpower on the part of the British people and British politicians. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was famous for this concern, and it's interesting that her very first campaign as a politician in 1950, I think, age 24, was she declared, "We must make Britain Great Britain great again. We must make Great Britain great again." So this concern is not a new one. But what I want to do is address it in this way. I think the issue is not so much decline. That's not what should surprise us. We should not be surprised at the position that Britain holds now in the world, which I think is pretty much what one might expect for a country of our size and population, but is actually the rise in the first place. Historically, what's surprising is rise, not decline. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the book, I argue that Britain's rise was historically quite remarkable. It's a country that prospered in the era of sea power, when it was important to have a large merchant fleet, because this was an island nation, so we had to import our food, our goods. We also had to protect our borders with a strong navy. And that merchant fleet and that navy were not only useful for defense, but for projecting Britain's power abroad, across the seas, creating an informal network of trade, and then increasingly formal colonies that Britain controlled. First of all, in the Caribbean and the Americas, then when the Americans, for some strange reason, decided to go their own way in 1776, particularly in India, the Indian subcontinent, and then in Africa. And so this was a remarkable empire that was created somewhat unintentionally in the era of sea power. And it enabled a kingdom of two pretty small islands off the coast of Europe, meaning the island of Britain and the island of Ireland, to take on a position in the world which was really quite exceptional. So that by 1860, a country that's got only 2% of the world's population is producing 50% of the world's iron and steel, and it's responsible for about 40% of the world's trade in manufactured goods. So that's, if you like, the rise. That's what made Britain great, those opportunities in the era of sea power and how the country exploited it. But that position for a small country of two relatively small islands was not sustainable indefinitely. That's fairly obvious if you think about it. For a start, there's the phenomenon of catch-up, industrial catch-up. Once other countries begin to pick up on the technologies that we had developed, they were able to develop in their own way and perhaps surpass those technologies. So that was one way in which our position was fragile or temporary. Also, what we see in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century particularly, is the consolidation and expansion of rival states, several of which were much larger in their territory and population than the United Kingdom. I'm meaning particularly the expansion of the Russian Empire across the Eurasia and into Asia itself, and also the United States developing from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, and equally important, holding together in the Civil War of 1861 to 65, which if the South had been successful in its secession, would have broken the country up into two rival and warring states. That doesn't happen. So you have these two big powers with much more potential than Britain. And also in the 20th century, you have the bid by Germany for control of a large part of Central Europe in two world wars. The other thing that changes, I think, is that, as I've mentioned, the empire is a creation of the era of sea power. But sea power is one particular kind of technology, a technology that is surpassed and transformed over time. So that once we're into an era of air power, the aeroplane flies over the barrier of the Channel, the moat defensive, as Shakespeare wonderfully called it, and it threatened us in a new way from the 1930s. The fear of air attack was something quite novel. After the war, although we survive the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, there are new technologies. There's the development of the jet engine, and also, of course, nuclear weapons after 1945. And then in the 1950s, medium range and intercontinental ballistic missiles, all of which make the Channel increasingly irrelevant in terms of our security. Fast forward to the present day, one of the major security threats is cyber warfare, has nothing to do with our island position. So we're in a situation, I think, where the position that Britain has now got to relative to other powers is not surprising. The surprise is how we got to that position of preeminence in the second half of the 19th century in the first place. So we should not, I think, be so surprised at where we are now. So that's the first point. Then if we move on to the second theme in the book and the second major chapter, there's the question of Europe. Because I've already been talking, if you like, about Europe, talking about the Channel and so on. And our tendency is still to think of the Channel as a barrier. And I've tried to suggest that that's not necessarily the case in an era where sea power has become less important. The Channel has become increasingly important as part of our sense of identity rather than our sense of security. And I want to explain that a little bit now. So my chapter about Europe starts with 1066 and all that. Not so much to just tell the story of the Norman conquest, but to emphasize a point that it's at that moment that Britain, or at this stage England, developed a close and, I would argue, continuing relationship with the continent of Europe. Remember that for nearly 4 centuries after the Norman conquest, English kings also have substantial claims on the territory of lands which we now consider to be France. Indeed, they claim to be, at periods of time, kings of France. And that in that period, the Channel is not so much a barrier, but a bridge, if you like, between 2 parts of the realm of England, of the English kings. And indeed, it's a lot quicker for medieval kings to get to France than it is to get to the Scottish border in an era where roads are mostly mud. Now, that period in which we claimed, or we effectively own, large parts of northern and indeed western France, that comes to an end with the end of the 100 Years' War in the 1450s. After that, there is a growing sense of England as a separate entity. And this is accentuated by the Protestant Reformation, and this is of enormous importance in our history. I mean, it's not something that we perhaps think about as much now in a more secular age than we ought to, I think. But from the middle of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, consolidated by the first Queen Elizabeth, sets us apart from continental Europe at a time when the Catholic powers are mounting the Counter-Reformation against the success of the Reformation itself. And that means that England increasingly has a sense of being embattled against the continental powers, particularly in the 16th century Spain, Catholic Spain. And some of our great historical moments, if you like, still remembered are, for example, the Spanish Armada, the defeat of that, the successful discovery of the gunpowder plot by Catholics against Protestant King James I, James VI of Scotland, first of England. These were regarded by people at the time as providential moments, signs that God favored this island and was protecting it from the Antichrist of the Pope. So this sense of special identity, of English exceptionalism, if you like, was formed in the Reformation. It was consolidated by the civil wars of the 1640s and 1650s, which ended up messily and bloodily with England and Wales as part of a constitutional monarchy with a parliament. And so Protestantism and Parliament were increasingly seen as distinctive features of this country. Nevertheless, despite that sense of the Channel now as a barrier, all English monarchs were quite clear that you could not be safe within the island unless you made sure that no power became too strong on the continent of Europe, particularly along the Channel coast, along the North Sea and French coast. Otherwise, that would pose a threat to the security of the country. So that meant being proactive. It meant intervening in foreign wars. Elizabeth I sent troops to fight against the Spanish to aid the Dutch revolt. Some of the great battles, again, of our history that are often recorded, battles like Blenheim and Waterloo, Blenheim in 1704, Waterloo in 1815. These were battles actually fought with allies, with continental allies. Blenheim with the Habsburgs against Louis XIV's France, and the Battle of Waterloo, though we don't always remember it as such, the victory was won because of the support of the Prussians for Wellington's army. That's what defeated Bonaparte. So this pattern of forming alliances carries on into the 20th century. In the First World War, France is now our ally, at this time against the Kaiser's Germany. And in the Second World War, the pattern changes somewhat. We still need allies, but because of the collapse of France in 1940, the allies that we fight that war with against Nazi Germany are countries from outside Europe, the Soviet Union, a rather surprising ally, and the United States, which seems a more natural ally from the point of view of the language and the cultural roots. But those allies mattered, and our story of sometimes of our war won by Britain alone misses out that essential point, as well as the fact, of course, that Britain is an empire, and the troops of the empire played a vital part in victories, particularly, say, the Battle of Alamein in 1942, could not have been won without the support of troops from the Commonwealth and from India. So this pattern then of British, English and British identity anchored in the specialness of the protected island, if you like, but dependent on allies to maintain the balance of power on the continent of Europe, European allies, and then international allies. That pattern is significantly affected by the Second World War. Significantly affected, particularly by 1940, by the fall of France and the sense of Britain standing alone, the feeling that we got through that year by our own devices, and it's of course associated with the tremendous reverence the country has now for the person and achievement of Winston Churchill. And Churchill encouraged us to think about our destiny in terms of a special relationship with America, with the English-speaking peoples, as he liked to talk about it. And that made us, I think, for a while as a country, somewhat indifferent to what was going on the continent of Europe. We did not take seriously the way that some of the defeated and ravaged powers of Western Europe got together in the 1950s to try and create a different kind of Europe, a more peaceful Europe, to move away from centuries of warfare. The European Economic Community, which came into existence in 1958, was a creation essentially of the French and the Germans, on the principle, if you like, that if after 300 years they weren't able to beat each other, then the best thing to do was to join together. If you can't beat them, join them. And we stood aloof from that process in the 1950s. We said, yes, it's good enough for them. It's good for European peace, but our destinies are very much global now, and we're not getting involved. And it was only when that European community took off from 1958, and particularly in the early 1960s, that we wanted to join in. And by then, it was difficult to do so. The pattern had begun to form, the organization had taken shape. We didn't join until 1973, which is 15 years after the European community came into existence. And that, I think, in retrospect, was a serious mistake, because if we had joined in the 1950s or got involved in the 1950s, we could have shaped that community perhaps rather more in the way we wanted, more like a free trade area. As it was, we've always been an awkward partner within the European community, the European Union. So for me, the Brexit story needs to be folded into this larger story of our relationship with Europe. It's not in a way surprising that we didn't feel comfortable. The Brexit vote, which was a mixture of serious planning and concern, but also a good deal of political opportunism in 2016, resulted in a situation that frankly neither side had prepared for, that we were going to leave the European Union. And we're still in the process of doing so. We're still in the process of sorting out what it actually means to have Brexited. But that, I think, is just part of the general pattern we've had of trying to deal with the continent of Europe. Our problem in the future is going to be that it's much harder to deal as one with a bloc 27 than to be inside a group of 28 trying to argue and maneuver for it, for what we want to do. But the challenge is essentially there. We have got to deal with that new block of 27, and it remains to be seen how we get on. So that's how I'd situate Brexit within, if you like, the last millennium of our relationship with Europe. Okay, so I've talked about decline, I've talked about Europe. The third of my main themes is Britain, the identity of Britain, the nature of Britain. Of course, actually, constitutionally, we are the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but nobody calls themselves a UKian. And I gather that really the term UK didn't catch on in any sort of popular way or even governmental way until the 1970s. So there's a kind of puzzlement or problem here about this identity. And it's also complicated by the fact that for people of earlier generations, certainly Churchill's generation, the term Britain and England were often used interchangeably in a way that, of course, is infuriating to the other parts of the UK, particularly to Scotland. My account of Britain and the development of what it is to be British is really rooted in the expansion of England, the expansion of the English domains from the days of the medieval kings, those medieval kings who'd also aspired to lands in France, also wanting to control this island and the other one, the island of Ireland. And so it's this empire building of the English kings, which has been a constant theme in the development of Britain and of eventually the United Kingdom. In that story, Wales was brought under English control and English governmental system in the 1530s by Henry VIII. Scotland, a much more complicated and frankly bloody story. Really 7 centuries of on-off warfare from the 11th century right up to, say, the Battle of Culloden in the 1740s. In which, if you like, to put it again very simply, the Scots discovered that they could not keep the English out. But the English discovered that they could not keep the Scots down. And out of this this long conflict emerged, first of all, a union of the crowns at the level of the kings, the monarchs, in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England as well. And then a union of the to parliaments in 1707, when the United Kingdom was formed. Now, if you're a Scottish nationalist, that's a kind of 1707 is a kind of Anschluss. It's a kind of English takeover through bribery and corruption and all the rest of it. On the other hand, if you look at it in another way, it's a situation in which the Scots still retain significant elements of their own autonomy, particularly their own law courts, their own church, and so on. In the case of Ireland, it is a union that is completed in 1801. Like the union with Scotland, prompted by wars with France and the fear that the French could get a foothold in Ireland and exploit it to threaten the Irish, the English, the kingdom. And what then holds this slightly conglomerate entity together in the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, particularly 19th century, is the shared project of the British Empire, the British Empire. And it's a project in which both Scots and Irish, if you like, punch way above their weight. They play a huge part in the governance of the empire, in the armies, the military that control the empire and expand the empire. Yet their relationship to the United Kingdom is somewhat different. Scotland, as I say, is a country with enough autonomy and indeed economic development, industrial development, to hold its own in the relationship with England. Ireland becomes in many ways an English colony. It's not developed economically in the same way as lowland Scotland was. It's mainly a source of agricultural produce, and because of the poverty of the country, also a source of labour. Lots of Irish labour coming over to England and Scotland to work in the developing industrial revolution and so on. So different kind of relationship between those two countries to the United Kingdom and the project. Now, the UK is seriously strained a century ago in the 1910s, not just by the movement for Irish Home Rule and then Irish independence, but also, and we sometimes forget this, there's a very strong Home Rule movement in Scotland just before the First World War, which is looking, if you like, for devolution. And in Wales, also strong anti-English agitation, not so much political here, but against the position of the Anglican Church in Wales, which controlled much of the land. And so there's a strong bid to disestablish the Church of the Anglican Church in Wales. That crisis is partly headed off and partly comes to ruination. Partly headed off in the case of Scotland and Wales, because it's clear that the experience of fighting the Great War and then the Second World War as part of the British Empire gives a new sense of identity, a pride in being British, but also a sense that Welsh regiments, Scottish regiments have played a distinctive part in the conflict. And that reduces that sense of Welsh and Scottish pressure for autonomy or devolution. In the case of Ireland, of course, what happens is that the bid for independence splits the island of Ireland. You end up with a war of independence and then a civil war in the south, in the Republic of Ireland, which scars the politics of the country for much of the 20th century. Whereas the Protestant enclave in the northeast becomes Northern Ireland, still a part of the United Kingdom. And of course, from the 1960s, the suppressed problems within Northern Ireland, discrimination against Catholics, leads to the notorious Troubles, which go on for 30 years and which lead to several thousand deaths, a militarized border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, bombs and violence in Britain itself, a really tragic time. The interesting point, and this is where I'm getting up to the contemporary time, is I think what I would call the Millennium Settlement, or sort of settlement, at the end of the 1990s. So I'm talking about the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which brings to an end or helps to bring to an end the Troubles. It doesn't happen immediately, but also creates a new relationship between the governments in London and Dublin and Belfast. It demilitarizes the border. It opens up a completely different set of relationships between North and South in Ireland. And also then in 1999, the creation of devolved assemblies in Edinburgh and in Cardiff, which allow both the Scots and the Welsh a degree of autonomy that they have not had for several centuries. And although the Scottish National Party, which comes to power with a majority government, I think in 2011, makes a bid for independence in the referendum of 2014, that is significantly defeated. I say significantly, 55% vote to stay in the UK, 45% want independence, and you could say that 45% of the country that want to be out of the UK is a really rather significant warning, and it is. But in terms of the practical politics for the moment, the UK holds together in 2014. So you could say that in at that point, there is a growing sense of a more looser, more open United Kingdom, less centralized, less run by London. That has been thrown into disarray by Brexit. It's fairly clear that very little thought was given to the implications of a leave vote for the rest of the United Kingdom. As you know, both the Scots voted and the Northern Irish voted to stay in the European Union. Their votes did not count in the end politically because this was a UK-wide referendum, but it still matters in terms of the sentiment in both of those parts of the UK, and particularly in Scotland, as you know. And the sense of dissatisfaction with London has been accentuated this last 6 months, by the very different ways that the four governments have dealt with the COVID emergency, which has accentuated this sense of difference with London and tension with London. So where it's going to go in the future remains to be seen, but we have now a much more disunited kingdom than we have had. And the sense of the country becoming more devolved has been called into question by recent events and by the more centralizing approach of the Johnson government in London itself. So there's the historical background, it seems to me, about Britain that we need to keep in mind. Finally and briefly, let me talk just a little bit about the empire. The narrative here is a rather familiar one. It's a kind of story about how the British made the empire and brought imperial rule, brought benefits of imperial rule, civilization, liberal values, Christianity, and so on. And then when these countries were ready for it, we conceded independence and they went their own way. And we, as it were, returned home and got on with our own business. My chapter on empire looks questioningly at that narrative, at that idea that we made the empire and then we gave it away. And I argue, and I'm not alone in this, and the book, in fact, is picking up on a lot of themes that are familiar to the historians. I argue that the empire made us as much as the other way around. In other words, that Britain has been fundamentally shaped by the experience of empire. Now, I haven't time to go into that story in detail, but here's one example which is quite pertinent at the moment in terms of our own experience of recent events. The issue of slavery. The positive narrative about Britain's role is to emphasize that we took a lead in the abolition of slavery, in the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the abolition of slavery in 1833. And that's undoubtedly true, in the sense that that legislation reflected some of the most extensive mass movements, political movements by ordinary people in Britain in our history. Huge numbers of petitions and protests and so on, infused by the moral energy of evangelical Protestantism. So that is definitely a given. But we can only take pride in that if we also recognize that the country made a huge profit from its prior involvement in the slave trade. The trade that made Britain great was not just in goods and products and raw materials, it was also in human beings. So, half of all the Africans carried into Atlantic slavery across the Atlantic in the 18th century were transported in British vessels. And British merchants made a very substantial profit on this, as you can see in cities like Bristol, or Glasgow, or Liverpool. We also profited hugely, even after we'd given up the slavery ourselves, from the continuation of slavery in the United States. The Lancashire cotton industry depended until the Civil War on cotton from the American South. That was absolutely vital. And it's also worth remembering that when we ended slavery, we never compensated the slaves, but we compensated the slave owners. 46,000 slave owners were compensated for the loss of their human property. 20 million pounds at the time, maybe it's like perhaps 75 billion in terms of current values. That is something that also has to be weighed in the balance when we're thinking about the abolition of slavery and our comforting moral narrative. Also in that chapter, I talk about the mass immigration after the Second World War from the former empire by people who had rights to come as British subjects in those days, citizens, brought here because governments wanted labor, cheap labor, with relatively little thought about the social and economic consequences, the human experience of these people, what effect it would have on the character of life, particularly in our cities. I'm not going to go into that story in great detail, but it's worth remembering where we are now. In the census that we have every 10 years, people are asked how they would identify themselves ethnically. In 1991, 94% of the population of the United Kingdom identified themselves as white. In 2011, 20 years later, the proportion identifying themselves as white is 86%. And it's estimated that by 2050, perhaps the figure, if we still do it this way, of people identifying themselves as whites will be perhaps 66%, 2/3 of the population. So we're literally, and we see it on our streets, we're seeing a changing face of Britain. We see it in our football teams, our cricket teams, all parts of our life. Yet the country has not come to terms with that. It's not really begun to think about the implications of the end of empire for the nature of the changing nature of Britain and what it means to be British. And that's an essential part, I think, of the way we should be thinking about our history. So on empire, like on the other themes I've mentioned, this sort of grand narrative of our island story needs, I think, some radical interrogation, radical questioning. But let's also remember that political leaders always need, understandably, to project a positive narrative about a country's past and its values. So the challenge that I'm addressing in the book is, how do we do that? How do we create a positive narrative without doing an injustice to our history, without representing our history in a simplistic and inaccurate way? Island Stories is a contribution to that debate. I hope you'll read it, and I hope you will think about some of the ideas in it. Thanks for listening to me. It's been a pleasure to be with you.